A still body of water stretches for miles, its glassy surface broken only by a lonely shape stabbing upward toward the sky. At first glance, it looks like the ruins of an ancient castle or a jagged cliff, but as you draw closer, its true form reveals itself, the bell tower of a church, its spire darkened and weathered, half submerged in the waters of a reservoir. It shouldn't be here. A house of God was not built to rise from the depths like a skeletal hand clawing toward the heavens. And yet, this tower is all that remains visible of a place long thought erased from the map. A village that lived, that breathed, that loved and suffered, until one day, it was swallowed whole. On calm mornings, when mist curls over the water like drifting smoke, the tower seems almost alive, as though the rest of the church might suddenly rise behind it. Travelers stop their cars along the roadside just to stare, to take photographs. Some whisper that the place feels cursed, that the air grows heavier the closer you approach. Others laugh it off, a quaint curiosity for tourists. But for those who know the story, who remember the tragedy that forced an entire community into exile, there is nothing quaint about it. The bell tower is not a monument. It is a wound. Decades ago, this valley was not water but farmland. Families built homes here, children played in its narrow streets, the church called its congregation to prayer every Sunday. For generations, the village thrived, until the day men with maps and clipboards arrived, speaking of progress, of power, of a future that required sacrifice. The valley was to be flooded for a reservoir. The villagers begged, protested, prayed, but their voices were drowned out by the promise of electricity and irrigation for distant cities. And so, brick by brick, life by life, the village was dismantled. Those who had tilled this soil for centuries were ordered to leave it behind. But while the villagers departed, not everything left with them. Some belongings remained. Some memories lingered. And beneath the rising waters, the stones of the church stood firm, as though unwilling to surrender. For years after, people spoke of the village only in past tense. It was gone, buried beneath the man-made lake. The tower remained, yes, but only as a marker, a gravestone jutting from the reservoir. And yet, as the decades passed, rumors began to circulate. On stormy nights, fishermen claimed they heard bells tolling from below. Divers reported shadows moving where no fish swam. Locals avoided the shoreline, convinced the drowned village still breathed in some way, that its story had not truly ended. And they were right. Because in time, the waters began to recede. Slowly at first, then dramatically, until more than just the tower was revealed. Low walls, broken streets, the skeletal outlines of homes, all rising from their watery grave. And at the heart of it all, standing silent and stubborn, was the church. Its walls cracked but unyielding, its doorway gaping like a mouth that had been forced shut for decades and was now ready to speak again. What, exactly, did this village wish to say? Journalists rushed to document the haunting sight. Photographers captured images that went viral, showing pews preserved in silt, children's toys half buried in mud, grave markers still bearing names. Families who had once lived here returned, weeping as they walked through ruins they recognized yet barely knew. And yet, amid the sorrow and awe, one thought gnawed at everyone who stood before the re-emerged church: what secrets could possibly remain inside, sealed away all this time? Because the villagers had long whispered of something hidden within those walls, something older and darker than the water itself. Some believed the church kept a secret chamber, others that its final days had seen desperate acts carried out within its stone sanctuary. When the flood came, many insisted, not everything was washed away. Most dismissed it as folklore. But folklore has a way of clinging to truth. And when divers finally ventured inside the newly exposed church, what they discovered went far beyond crumbling altars and ruined icons. It was something disturbing, something that made even hardened investigators uneasy. Something that raised the possibility that the church had never been a safe haven at all. Something that suggested this village was drowned not just by water, but by design. Before the waters came, before the valley was condemned to silence, there was life. The village lay tucked in a green basin surrounded by rolling hills, a place so unremarkable on a map that outsiders barely knew it existed. But for those who lived here, it was everything. Stone cottages with red-tiled roofs lined the narrow streets. Chickens wandered freely in dusty courtyards. Farmers rose with the dawn to work the land, their hands calloused but proud. Children fetched water from the communal fountain, their laughter echoing against church walls. It was not wealth that kept them here but belonging. Generations had tilled the same fields, prayed in the same pews, and buried their dead in the same soil. At the center stood the church, a squat but sturdy building with thick stone walls, its bell calling villagers to weddings, funerals, baptisms, and mass. It was not only a place of faith but of identity. To stand in its shadow was to feel rooted in something greater than oneself, something immovable. Or so they thought. Change began quietly. Rumors first, whispered at the tavern, then in the marketplace. Engineers had been surveying the valley, men in pressed suits with rolled-up maps and strange instruments. They spoke of a dam that would tame the river, a reservoir that would feed thirsty cities miles away, and power stations that would electrify villages still lit by oil lamps. Progress, they called it. To the villagers, it sounded like a threat. Meetings were held. Some officials spoke with practiced smiles, promising compensation, promising relocation, promising that this sacrifice would be remembered as noble. But others were blunt, the valley would be flooded whether the villagers agreed or not. Papers were signed in government offices far from the hills, decisions made by men who had never walked these streets. The news struck like a death sentence. Families gathered at kitchen tables, trying to imagine leaving the only homes they had ever known. Some wept. Some raged. Others simply stared in silence, as though unable to process what was coming. How could a lifetime of memories be priced in currency? How do you pack the weight of a family's history into a wagon and move it elsewhere? The church became a rallying point. Parishioners knelt not just to pray, but to plead. God will not allow this, some said. They petitioned, they protested, they begged engineers to reroute the project. But the dam's location had been chosen, and the valley's fate was sealed. The exodus began slowly. Wealthier families moved first, buying land in neighboring towns. But most had little choice but to accept what meager compensation was offered. Wooden doors were shut for the last time, windows boarded, barns abandoned. Each departure felt like a funeral. Neighbors hugged and swore they would meet again, though deep down they knew their community was dissolving. One old woman, in tears, was overheard whispering as she clutched the church steps, "If they drown this house of God, it will not forgive them." Others muttered darker things, stories about what the church had seen, what it might still be hiding. To outsiders, such talk was superstition. To the villagers, it was memory. When the final day arrived, it was chaos. Trucks and carts piled high with furniture and animals jammed the narrow roads. Children clung to toys, mothers carried photographs and family Bibles, fathers tried to keep their anger contained. At the church, the bell rang not for prayer but for farewell. Its tolling echoed across the valley as families turned their backs on everything they had known. Government workers moved in swiftly after. Houses were stripped for salvage, roofs torn away to prevent dangerous floating debris. Cemeteries were disturbed, graves moved hastily, though not all. Rumors spread that certain headstones had been left behind, that not every body had been reburied. Officials denied it, but unease grew. And then, as the dam gates closed, the waters came. It started as a trickle, then a flood. Fields disappeared, roads vanished, and slowly the rooftops of homes slipped beneath the surface. People watched from the hills, silent, numb. Some said they heard cries, not from the villagers, but from the valley itself. The final thing to vanish was the church. Its doors buckled, windows shattered, yet its stone walls resisted until the last possible moment. The tower remained visible for a time, like a drowning man's hand reaching upward. And then even that was swallowed, until nothing remained but still, endless water. But the silence didn't last. Strange things began to happen around the new reservoir. Locals swore they could hear bells ringing from beneath the surface on certain nights. Fishermen claimed their nets snagged on things that were not rocks. Visitors described an uneasy feeling in the air, as though the water itself remembered. Officials dismissed these as ghost stories. But the villagers, now scattered across neighboring towns, knew better. They said the valley had not gone quietly. They said the church had kept its secrets. And indeed, as the years passed, questions refused to drown. Why this valley, when others could have served the project just as well? Why the rush to demolish homes but leave the church standing? Why did some families whisper that loved ones were left behind, locked inside during those final days? Folklore is rarely born from nothing. Beneath the calm surface of the reservoir lay stories no one wanted to tell, truths no one wanted to face. And when the waters eventually began to recede, revealing the bones of the village once more, the world would discover that those old warnings had not been empty at all. Years passed. The dam fulfilled its promise, electricity surged into distant cities, irrigation flowed to farmlands miles away, and the drowned valley was spoken of less and less. For outsiders, it had become nothing more than a technical achievement, a mark of progress on a government ledger. But for those who once called it home, forgetting was impossible. The reservoir was not just water. It was a mirror. On clear days, descendants swore they could still see outlines beneath the surface, dark shapes of rooftops, the faint suggestion of streets winding through the depths. When the wind was still, the surface lay too smooth, too silent, as though holding its breath. And when storms broke, waves slapped against the hidden ruins with a violence that seemed almost personal. Whispers began to circulate, and with them, fear. Fishermen were often the first to speak of it. They said that when their boats drifted too close to where the church tower once stood, they heard sounds below. Sometimes it was the toll of a bell, impossibly faint but distinct, echoing as though from the bottom of the lake. Other times, it was a murmur, voices rising and falling in the drowned valley, too muffled to make out words, yet human enough to chill the blood. Locals claimed that nets cast in those waters came back torn or snagged on something more stubborn than stone. A few whispered of bodies surfacing, bloated and unrecognizable, only to vanish again before officials arrived. Authorities dismissed such tales as drunken inventions, but the rumors clung like algae to the reservoir's surface. The tower itself did not remain fully hidden. During dry seasons, its spire sometimes rose again, jagged and dark against the horizon. For travelers passing through, it was a curiosity, an old ruin caught in the wrong place. But for those who knew, it was a reminder. Mothers told their children not to swim near it. Teenagers dared each other to row out and touch its stones, a game that sometimes ended with panicked screams and overturned boats. Then came the accidents. A boy drowned while swimming with friends, his body recovered days later with scratches across his limbs, as though he had been dragged. A fisherman vanished entirely, his empty boat found drifting near the tower. Rescue divers who searched claimed their equipment malfunctioned inexplicably near the ruins. Each incident was logged as a tragedy, nothing more. But in taverns and kitchens, people spoke more freely, the village beneath the lake was restless. Folklore blossomed. Some said the bell rang at night to call the dead to mass. Others believed the church had trapped something inside when the waters came, and now it clawed at the surface for release. The most enduring tale was simpler, that the villagers had not left alone. That some, chained or confined, had gone down with the church, and their spirits wandered still, demanding to be remembered. Decades blurred together, but the stories never died. They became part of the reservoir's identity, whispered to tourists, laughed off as entertainment but never truly forgotten. Skeptics called it nonsense, yet admitted unease when the fog rolled over the water, shrouding the tower like a shivering ghost. And then, one summer, something shifted. Rainfall was scarce, the dam's reserve strained. Week by week, the water level dropped lower than anyone had seen in living memory. Shorelines widened, cracked earth replacing the usual lapping waves. At first, only a few stones broke the surface, half buried in silt. Then, outlines of walls appeared, fractured but undeniable. Slowly, the skeleton of the village emerged from its watery grave. The return was gradual, like a body surfacing after being held under too long. Families who once lived there, or their children and grandchildren, traveled back to witness it. Some carried cameras, others flowers. They walked across dried mud that had once been fields, staring at the crumbled remains of kitchens where meals were shared, or doorways where first steps were taken. But it was the church that drew the most attention. Its bell tower, now revealed in full, loomed heavier and darker than anyone remembered. The entrance yawned like a wound, half clogged with debris, yet unmistakably intact. For decades, villagers had whispered that the church still kept its secrets. Now those whispers turned into urgent questions. What would be found inside? Newspapers seized on the story. Photographers captured haunting images of cracked pews, stone walls etched with strange watermarks, crosses tilted as if bowing under the weight of time. The images spread, and fascination grew. The drowned village was no longer just folklore, it was a stage, a relic returned, demanding to be explored. And soon, divers answered the call. Teams assembled, outfitted with cameras, lights, and gear, determined to chart the church's interior. Officials discouraged it, citing safety concerns, but curiosity overpowered caution. The public wanted to know, had the flood buried only stone and wood, or had it buried something darker? As the divers prepared to descend into the church, villagers gathered on the cracked earth outside, watching. Some crossed themselves, muttering prayers. Others turned away, unwilling to witness what might be uncovered. Because when the church finally opened its mouth to the living world again, no one could say what would come out. The summer that changed everything began without drama. It was simply hot, hotter than usual, drier than anyone could remember. Rain clouds passed without breaking, the river feeding the reservoir shrank to a trickle, and officials quietly warned of water shortages. Most people were concerned with crops, with drinking water, with the risk of wildfires. No one imagined the drought would strip away not just the present, but the past. But day by day, the water receded. First the shoreline pulled back, exposing mudflats and twisted branches. Then it sank farther, revealing shapes no natural drought could explain. Straight lines. Right angles. Walls. Stone by stone, the drowned village clawed its way back into daylight. News spread fast. Locals who had heard stories from their parents and grandparents rushed to the reservoir to see for themselves. They expected rubble. Instead, they found streets still etched into the ground, foundations of houses standing like skeletal ribs, even fragments of doorframes and windows glinting in the harsh sun. It was as though the village had simply been asleep, waiting for the day it could open its eyes again. Journalists arrived next, cameras in hand. Photographs splashed across newspapers, children walking down what had once been their ancestors' main street, families standing beside the crumbled remains of their old homes. Some visitors smiled, treating it like a curiosity. Others wept openly, overcome by the weight of memory. And at the very center, the church revealed itself at last. The bell tower, once just a lonely marker on the surface, now stood connected to the body that had always been hidden. The church's walls rose proudly, weather-stained but intact. Its arched doorway gaped like a mouth left open mid-scream, its roof long gone but its skeleton sturdy. Inside, rows of pews sat half-buried in silt, like an audience frozen in time. Light spilled through the broken windows, dancing across the cracked altar where generations had been married, baptized, and mourned. The sight was haunting, almost theatrical. The church did not look destroyed. It looked preserved. Too preserved. Visitors described a strange feeling upon stepping inside. The air was heavier, cooler despite the blazing sun outside. Some claimed they felt watched. Others said the silence was overwhelming, the kind of silence that presses against your chest and refuses to let go. Parents pulled their children away quickly, muttering that they'd seen enough. But photographers stayed, fascinated by the eerie beauty. Their images went viral, rosaries dangling from crumbling walls, children's shoes stuck in dried mud, a crucifix tilted sideways like a man hanging by his neck. The stories began almost immediately. Descendants swore they recognized personal belongings inside, an iron pot, a carved chair, a toy horse. These should have rotted or washed away long ago, yet somehow they endured. Skeptics argued it was coincidence, or that memory plays tricks. But the coincidences piled up too neatly to ignore. Soon, the site became a pilgrimage. Families traveled hundreds of miles to see the ruins. Tourists poured in, drawn by both curiosity and morbid fascination. Vendors sold postcards with images of the bell tower. Guides told half-whispered tales of drowned spirits and tolling bells. Officials grew nervous. The sudden influx strained the fragile ruins, and rumors began to swirl, rumors that someone would soon venture into the church itself to discover what secrets the water had guarded all these years. It did not take long. Divers had explored the tower in decades past, when it still poked above the waterline, but they had never been able to penetrate the full structure. Now, with the church standing open on dry ground, the opportunity was irresistible. Teams of adventurers, archaeologists, and thrill-seekers prepared to enter. They carried cameras, flashlights, and the thrill of discovery. Officials warned them to stay back, the structure was unstable, the mud dangerous, but the warnings only fueled the excitement. One group in particular captured public attention. A small team of experienced divers turned explorers arrived with equipment designed not just to enter but to document everything inside. Their leader, a man with years of experience in underwater archaeology, admitted to reporters that he'd dreamed of this day since he was a child hearing stories of the drowned village. "It's not just history," he said. "It's memory. And memories deserve to be seen." Crowds gathered outside as the team prepared to step through the broken doors. Reporters shouted questions. Descendants watched in silence, clutching photographs of their lost relatives. An old woman was overheard whispering prayers, her voice trembling, "Leave it. Leave it buried." But curiosity overpowered caution. The team crossed the threshold. The cameras followed them into darkness, where beams of light swept across walls encrusted with algae, revealing inscriptions etched by hand long before the flood. They filmed every corner, every fragment of wood, every relic the water had failed to claim. At first, it seemed harmless, ruins like any other, preserved by accident rather than design. And then, deeper inside, they found sealed spaces. Hidden alcoves. Objects that should not have survived. What they discovered next would shock even the most skeptical. It was not just debris. Not just relics. It was something far darker, something that raised questions no one was prepared to answer. And for those watching from outside, waiting under the harsh summer sun, the silence of the explorers' radio stretched unbearably long. Because when they finally emerged from the church, pale and shaken, their eyes told the story before their mouths could. The drowned village had not been resting all these years. It had been keeping a secret. The church had waited in silence for decades, half buried, half forgotten. Now, at last, its doors were open again. The team of divers turned explorers stood in front of the arched entrance, their gear clinking softly in the heat. Though the reservoir had retreated, mud clung thickly to every step, sucking at their boots. The air inside the structure was damp, colder than expected, and carried a faint metallic tang, like rust, or old blood. The cameras switched on, their beams of white light cutting into the gloom. And then, one by one, they crossed the threshold. From the outside, the church had seemed frozen in time. Inside, it felt more like stepping into another world. The first thing that struck them was the silence. No birds nested here, no wind rattled loose beams. Only the echo of their footsteps, distorted as though bouncing off walls that were somehow farther away than they should be. The explorers swept their lights across the nave. Wooden pews lay half submerged in hardened silt, warped but still recognizable. Some were upright, as if waiting for a congregation that never came. Others had collapsed, their backs broken under the weight of years. The altar stood at the far end, cracked but unyielding, draped in water stains that spread like veins across the stone. Behind it, a crucifix leaned forward, tilted at an unnatural angle, the figure of Christ eroded almost faceless. One of the team muttered under his breath, forgetting his microphone was live, "It feels wrong in here." They pressed on. In alcoves along the walls, niches still held remnants of statues, saints with heads missing, Madonna figures blurred by water damage. A rosary dangled from a fragment of plaster, its beads clinking faintly when touched by the draft. The team documented everything meticulously, knowing the footage would spark fascination worldwide. At first, what they found was remarkable but not shocking. A hymn book preserved between pews, its pages fused together like stone. Candlesticks toppled but unbroken. Even a child's wooden toy, lodged in a corner where the mud had protected it from decay. These were relics of ordinary life, echoes of a community forced to abandon its home. But deeper inside, things grew stranger. One diver noticed an uneven seam in the wall near the chancel, a line of stones that did not match the others. When tapped, the section gave off a hollow sound. After clearing away debris, they discovered a sealed doorway, bricked over long before the flood. Excitement surged. Hidden chambers were not unusual in old churches, many concealed storage spaces, crypts, or even priest holes. But the timing of this one felt deliberate, as if it had been closed off hastily, perhaps in the final days before the valley drowned. With careful hands, the team pried loose stones until a narrow opening appeared. Stale air rushed out, carrying with it a smell that made one explorer gag, dampness mixed with something sour, something old. Flashlights probed the darkness inside. The space was small, barely large enough for two people to stand side by side. Its walls were rough, unfinished, unlike the rest of the church. On the floor lay a collection of objects that should not have been there. Rusted chains bolted into the stone. A wooden stool, toppled. Scraps of cloth that looked disturbingly like clothing, though blackened and brittle. And in one corner, something else, a pile of bones. The team froze. They had expected relics, maybe artifacts, but not this. The bones were human. Some were scattered, others arranged in a way that seemed unnatural, as though left in haste. Rusted metal cuffs still clung to what had once been wrists. The explorers backed out, shaken, their breathing sharp in the microphones. The chamber was photographed, filmed, documented, but their unease grew heavier with each passing minute. Because this was not the only sealed space. Another was found behind the sacristy, this one containing remnants of wooden crates, their contents unidentifiable but smelling of rot. Another, smaller chamber yielded broken pottery, a rusted chalice, and more bones, these piled neatly, as if stored rather than buried. What did it mean? Theories came fast. Some whispered it was plague-related, that the church had been used as a quarantine zone in the years before the flood. Others speculated it had been a prison of sorts, a place where political or religious dissenters were locked away. The villagers' old stories, dismissed for decades as superstition, suddenly felt sharper, more believable. The explorers pressed deeper, driven by equal parts fear and compulsion. Every new discovery seemed to blur the line between sanctuary and something far darker. In one alcove, beneath layers of silt, they uncovered fragments of parchment sealed inside a jar. The writing was water-damaged beyond recognition, but faint Latin words could still be seen: culpa, pena, sacrificium. Guilt. Punishment. Sacrifice. One of the team turned his camera to the altar. Something about it seemed wrong. The stone slab was thicker than necessary, its base uneven. When they examined it closely, they realized it had been hollowed out, like a container. Inside, half filled with hardened silt, were objects that chilled them further: knives, candlesticks warped by fire, and what looked like a ceremonial mask, carved from wood and painted in streaks that might once have been red. By now, the explorers were visibly shaken. The footage shows their movements slowing, their voices subdued. This was no longer the triumphant discovery of a lost village. It was something else, an unraveling, a revelation too dark to dismiss. As they made their way back toward the entrance, one of them stopped, shining his light toward the upper beams. There, carved faintly into the stone above the nave, were symbols, circles intersected by crosses, stars with uneven points, markings that did not resemble Christian iconography at all. Whether they were graffiti, remnants of older traditions, or something deliberately hidden in plain sight, no one could say. But their presence only deepened the dread. When the team finally emerged from the church, hours later, their faces told the story more vividly than words. Pale, shaken, eyes wide. Reporters shouted questions. Crowds pressed forward. But the explorers gave only vague responses. They spoke of relics, of historical significance, of important finds. They did not mention the bones, the chains, the mask. Not yet. But word leaked anyway. One photograph, smuggled out by a member of the team, showed a skeletal hand still bound by rusted shackles. Another showed the strange jar of parchment. Within days, newspapers exploded with headlines, "Skeletons in the Sunken Church." "Secrets of the Drowned Village." Did the flood hide a crime? The questions multiplied faster than the answers. Who were the people locked in those chambers? Why had the church concealed them? And, perhaps most chilling, why had officials worked so hard to keep divers away in the past? For now, the evidence sat in the hands of a few shaken explorers, fragments of a puzzle too dark to assemble. But what they had uncovered was undeniable. The church had not drowned quietly. It had drowned with secrets chained inside it. And the world had only just begun to understand what those secrets meant. The photographs should never have left the divers' possession. Officially, their work was archaeological, a simple documentation of ruins exposed by drought. But once the images leaked, the story slipped out of their control. The first photo was blurry, a grainy shot of a skeletal hand reaching upward through hardened silt. At first glance, it looked staged, almost theatrical. But then came the details, rusted metal cuffs still clamped tight around the bone. A wrist chained to the church wall. And suddenly, the drowned village was no longer a curiosity, it was a crime scene. The divers tried to downplay it. They spoke of historical anomalies, of possible plague burials, of ritual practices lost to time. But their pale faces, caught in candid footage, betrayed them. They had seen something that words could not disguise. More photographs followed. A skull half buried beneath the altar, jaw gaping open as if mid-scream. A pile of ribs stacked with a precision that seemed intentional, almost ritualistic. Chains bolted into stone, their ends twisted and broken. Each image raised more questions, each detail more chilling than the last. Theories multiplied overnight. Some historians argued the skeletons were plague victims. In past centuries, entire families had been locked inside churches to die, quarantined in desperation to stop disease from spreading. But others countered that explanation. Plague burials were usually mass graves, quick and chaotic. These remains looked staged, arranged, chained. Another theory surfaced: the church had been used as a prison. Political dissenters, heretics, even accused witches may have been confined here, their punishment hidden from the wider world. The bones told of suffering, not accidental death. The rusted chains suggested confinement, not burial. But whispers grew darker still. Some pointed to the strange symbols carved into the stone, to the ceremonial mask found beneath the altar, to the word sacrificium, faintly visible on the waterlogged parchment. Was this church not only a place of worship, but of ritual that blurred the line between faith and something more sinister? The villagers' old stories suddenly rang louder. For decades, descendants had repeated tales of their grandparents' warnings, that the church was not a sanctuary, that things happened there no one spoke of aloud. At the time, it sounded like folklore, born of resentment toward the authorities who drowned their home. But now, with bones and chains pulled from the mud, those whispers sounded like testimony. The descendants gathered at the site, faces grim. An elderly man clutched a rosary as he told a reporter, "We always knew. My grandfather said they locked people inside. Said the bells rang when no priest pulled the rope. Said the church had a hunger." Officials scrambled to contain the chaos. The site was closed off, citing safety concerns. Divers were ordered to halt further exploration. Artifacts were quietly seized and transported for conservation. But the damage was done. The world had seen enough to know that something had been buried, and not just underwater. Journalists pressed harder. Why had the government been so insistent on flooding this particular valley, when others could have served the dam project? Why had access to the church been restricted for decades? What records existed of the village's final years? Officials dodged questions, offering bureaucratic answers, but the silence only fueled suspicion. And then, the personal stories began to emerge. One woman, the granddaughter of a displaced villager, recalled hearing as a child that her great-aunt had disappeared before the flooding. "They told me she went away," she said. "But my grandfather cried whenever her name was mentioned. He said she was last seen entering the church." Another family claimed their ancestor had been accused of witchcraft by the local priest, only weeks before the valley was evacuated. Their descendants now wondered if those accusations had ended not in exile, but in chains beneath the altar. The discoveries hit hardest among the displaced families. To them, the bones were not abstract. They were kin. They were neighbors. They were the ones who never left. One man stood by the cracked remains of a house and whispered, "Maybe that's why my grandmother always said the water was cursed. She knew there were still people down there." His voice trembled, his eyes fixed on the church as if it might answer him. The divers, once eager to share their find, grew quieter. One admitted anonymously to a journalist that he'd had nightmares since entering the church. Dreams of water filling his lungs, of chains tightening around his wrists. Another swore he heard whispers in Latin when reviewing his footage, though no one else on his team could confirm it. Whether hallucination, stress, or something stranger, none of them wanted to go back. And yet the world demanded answers. Historians pored over the leaked images, debating whether they showed evidence of religious persecution, criminal punishment, or something darker. Forensic experts speculated on the bones, suggesting the remains belonged to both men and women, some as young as teenagers. Theories clashed, but one thing was undeniable: the church had been a place of suffering. And so the narrative shifted. The drowned village was no longer a tragic relic of forced displacement. It was now something far more sinister, a place where atrocities had occurred, sealed away by water, erased from memory until drought pried it open. But the question lingered: had the flood been an accident of progress, or a deliberate burial of shame? The villagers' bitterness resurfaced. For decades, they had mourned their lost homes, believing themselves victims of modernity. Now they wondered if they had also been pawns in a cover-up. The dam, they whispered, had not only provided electricity. It had drowned evidence. The truth remained murky, like the water that once swallowed the church. No one could say with certainty who the bones belonged to, or why they were chained. But the images were enough. Enough to haunt, enough to outrage, enough to suggest that history had not been erased by accident. In the end, the divers had uncovered more than relics. They had unearthed a wound. And once revealed, such wounds refused to close. Because now, the world wanted answers. And buried deep in archives, in records long ignored, the pieces of that truth were waiting to be found. If the church walls could speak, they would tell of centuries. But stone keeps its silence, and so the only voices left were in brittle paper, parchments, letters, and records forgotten in archives, gathering dust. After the divers' discovery, journalists and historians turned to those archives, searching for answers buried in ink rather than mud. What they found only deepened the unease. The first clue came from diocesan records, a set of handwritten reports from the 17th century. On the surface, they seemed routine, lists of baptisms, marriages, funerals. But buried between the lines were strange notations. Whole families entered on the rolls, then abruptly crossed out with a single word, exclusus. Excluded. No explanation given. No follow-up notes. Even stranger were the gaps. Years with missing registers, as though pages had been deliberately removed. In a ledger from 1692, the priest wrote a cryptic note in the margin: certain sins must be hidden, lest they curse the valley. Historians debated the meaning. Was it superstition? A metaphor for secrecy within the parish? Or a chilling hint that something had indeed been hidden, sins sealed in stone, later in water? Further digging uncovered letters from the early 1800s, correspondence between clergy and local authorities. One letter, written in hurried Latin, referenced unrest among the villagers, caused by accusations within the holy place. Another spoke of individuals detained for the preservation of order, to be remembered by God though forgotten by men. The phrasing was delicate, almost evasive, but the implication clear enough: people had been confined inside the church. But why? Some researchers believed the answer lay in the church's dual role. In small, isolated villages, churches were not only houses of worship but also centers of power, spiritual, political, and judicial. Priests acted as mediators of faith, but also as enforcers of moral conduct. Those accused of heresy, witchcraft, or even simple disobedience could be punished not by courts, but by clergy. And in this particular church, punishment seemed to mean confinement. The chains in the chamber were not symbolic. They were functional. Folklore collected from the displaced villagers supported this. Old stories told of bells ringing in the night when no one was inside, of screams muffled by stone walls, of shadows in the windows long after Mass had ended. One legend described a room where the guilty waited for God's judgment. At the time, these tales had been dismissed as rural superstition. But paired with the physical evidence, they began to sound more like memories. Then came the most startling find. In a provincial archive, a historian uncovered a court record dated just decades before the flood. It documented a complaint filed by villagers against the parish priest, accusing him of unholy practices and keeping souls against their will. The document was never followed by a verdict. The case disappeared from the record entirely. Some suspected it had been suppressed. Others believed it was resolved quietly, by flooding the valley. To the descendants, this revelation was both validation and torment. For years, their families had whispered about the church's darkness, but outsiders dismissed it as bitterness over displacement. Now the paper trail confirmed it: their ancestors had tried to raise the alarm, and no one listened. The deeper the researchers looked, the stranger the details became. A faded inventory list described objects stored in the sacristy: masks, knives, and books of forbidden prayer. Another noted parchments sealed in jars to preserve their words against the water. The very items divers later recovered. Even the architecture raised questions. Engineers who studied the blueprints of similar churches noted anomalies, hidden spaces that did not align with the visible structure, suggesting intentional concealment. The bricked-off chambers discovered by divers fit this pattern perfectly. And yet, the official records of the dam project made no mention of these anomalies. In fact, they treated the village as unremarkable, another rural casualty of modernization. No warnings, no notations about historical significance, no effort to relocate or preserve artifacts. To skeptics, that absence spoke volumes. By now, the story had escaped academic circles and bled into the public imagination. Documentaries, podcasts, and articles dissected every detail, every rumor. Some emphasized the theory of plague victims. Others leaned toward ritual sacrifice, pointing to the parchment's chilling words: culpa, pena, sacrificium. Guilt. Punishment. Sacrifice. The truth, however, remained elusive. Each discovery seemed to confirm two things: that the church had been a site of suffering, and that someone, whether the clergy, the state, or both, had gone to great lengths to ensure those sufferings were forgotten. The villagers who returned to see the ruins after the drought walked the muddy streets with a mixture of awe and dread. To them, every brick, every shadow carried memory. Some prayed at the church's threshold, whispering apologies to those who had never left. Others refused to go near it, insisting the walls still held anger. One old woman, her voice trembling, told a journalist, "They always said the flood was for electricity. But maybe it was for silence. To drown the screams that still lived here." The archival trail, like the village itself, eventually sank back into obscurity, fragments without resolution. The papers were incomplete, the stories contradictory, the truth just out of reach. But one fact became undeniable: the flood had not only buried a village. It had buried a scandal. And now, with the waters receding, that scandal was clawing its way back into the light. By the time the second drought season arrived, the church was no longer just a ruin, it was a stage. Reporters from across the country gathered at the muddy shoreline, microphones and cameras pointed at the skeletal walls. Drones buzzed overhead, capturing aerial shots of the drowned village, while headlines screamed across every platform: "The Church of Chains. The skeletons of the reservoir. Secrets beneath the water." What had begun as a local curiosity had erupted into a national obsession. Talk shows debated theories. Newspapers printed grainy photos of shackled bones on their front pages. Online forums filled with speculation, some grounded in history, others wild with imagination. And beneath all the noise, one question pulsed like a drumbeat: what really happened in that church? Governments scrambled to control the narrative. Officials insisted the skeletons were plague victims, casualties of medieval quarantine practices. They cited common historical precedents and stressed that no evidence pointed to anything criminal or ritualistic. But their words fell flat. Because the leaked photos told a different story, one of deliberate confinement, not hurried burial. The more officials downplayed, the louder the conspiracies grew. Some believed the flood had been engineered not just for electricity, but to erase the scandal of the church. Others claimed the chains suggested not prisoners, but sacrifices, victims offered in dark ceremonies masquerading as Christian ritual. A few went further still, tying the discovery to whispers of secret societies, suggesting the valley had once been a testing ground for cult practices hidden beneath the church's holy veneer. Each theory fed into the next, creating a storm of suspicion impossible to silence. Meanwhile, the divers who had first entered the church became reluctant celebrities. Hounded by reporters, some gave interviews, their words carefully measured. But their haunted expressions betrayed them. One diver admitted he could not return to the site. "I still hear it at night," he whispered. "Chains dragging, voices in Latin I never learned." His confession went viral, replayed millions of times, dissected frame by frame as if it contained a hidden code. The families of displaced villagers added fuel to the fire. Standing before cameras, they demanded justice, not only for the loss of their homes, but for the ancestors who, they now believed, had been deliberately entombed. An elderly man broke down on live television, clutching a photograph of his grandmother. "She never came back from the church. Now I know why." His tears ignited public outrage. Historians tried to ground the frenzy, publishing articles that explained medieval quarantine customs, heresy trials, and folk rituals. But the careful language of academia was no match for the raw power of rumor and fear. Every time a scholar insisted the bones could be plague victims, someone would counter with, "Then why the chains?" The conspiracy took on a life of its own. Protesters gathered near government buildings, demanding transparency. Online campaigns spread hashtags like and petitions circulated, demanding an independent investigation into why the valley had been flooded in the first place. And still, the authorities stayed silent. No official forensic report was released. No timeline was offered for artifact analysis. The secrecy only sharpened suspicion. Then came the leaks. A journalist published scans of archival letters suggesting clergy had indeed imprisoned villagers accused of heresy and witchcraft. Another outlet claimed anonymous sources within the government confirmed political prisoners were held in the church during a forgotten rebellion. Neither claim could be fully verified, but both hit headlines with devastating force. The church was no longer just a ruin. It had become a symbol of corruption, of secrecy, of history's ability to hide its darkest truths beneath water and stone. Crowds now gathered at the dried lakebed, some to mourn, others to gawk. Vendors sold trinkets shaped like chains, rosaries carved from driftwood. Tourists posed for selfies in front of the eroded crucifix, while descendants prayed on their knees in the mud. The site had transformed into both spectacle and shrine. But beneath the spectacle, tension brewed. Police were deployed to prevent looting after reports surfaced of bones being stolen from the ruins. One tabloid claimed a skull had been smuggled out, sold on the black market to a collector of occult relics. Whether true or not, it stoked outrage further. As the frenzy built, the drought ended. Rain returned, and slowly, inexorably, the waters rose again. Villagers watched in silence as the church disappeared once more beneath the surface, its secrets hidden again. But this time, the water did not erase memory. The images were out there. The questions had been asked. And as the church sank, so too did trust, in the authorities, in the official narrative, in the ability to ever know the truth. And yet, for many, the sinking only deepened the obsession. Because now the church was not simply a ruin. It was a tomb sealed twice, once by stone, once by water. And the world was left asking, if the truth was so ordinary, why had so much effort been spent to bury it? When the waters closed again over the valley, the church seemed to vanish, but the evidence it had given up could not be drowned a second time. The bones, the chains, the fragments of parchment, all had been collected and quietly transported to laboratories. For months, the public heard nothing. Silence stretched, feeding speculation. And then, at last, the science began to speak. The first reports came from anthropologists who examined the skeletons. There were at least 19 individuals recovered from the chambers, though the true number might have been higher. Many remains were fragmented, commingled, their identities blurred by decades of water damage. But even in their brokenness, the bones told stories. Some belonged to men, others to women. Shockingly, at least 4 sets of remains were identified as adolescents, boys or girls no older than 14. Age markers in the teeth confirmed it. For many, this detail was the most haunting. These were not just prisoners or outcasts. They were children. The bones bore marks, subtle but undeniable. Wrist bones showed compression consistent with shackles. Some femurs carried grooves, as though cords or chains had dug deep during restraint. A few skulls revealed blunt force trauma, injuries that suggested violence rather than disease. In one chilling case, ribs displayed puncture marks that might have come from a blade. These were not plague victims left to die in quarantine. They were captives. Forensic teams also studied the arrangement of the remains. The piles of bones beneath the altar did not follow any known Christian burial pattern. Instead, the careful stacking suggested deliberate placement, almost ritualistic. The bones had not simply been hidden, they had been displayed, stored, or preserved with intention. And then there were the artifacts. The ceremonial mask recovered beneath the altar, once tested, revealed traces of red pigment, likely cinnabar, a toxic mineral historically used in both paint and ritual. Residues of wax and soot suggested it had been worn during candlelit ceremonies. Its exaggerated features, hollow eyes, and jagged mouth bore no resemblance to Christian iconography. Scholars compared it to folkloric masks used in pre-Christian rituals meant to ward off evil or channel spirits. The knives found nearby were equally unsettling. Though corroded, their shapes suggested ceremonial rather than utilitarian use, thin, tapering blades designed not for cutting bread or rope, but flesh. The parchment fragments were studied under infrared light. Most text was illegible, but certain words emerged with clarity. Alongside culpa, guilt, pena, punishment, and sacrificium, sacrifice, researchers identified another term, tenebrae. Darkness. Taken together, the evidence painted a picture no one wanted to see, that within the walls of this church, punishment had intertwined with ritual. That faith and fear had blurred into something darker. Of course, officials resisted such conclusions. Government spokespeople insisted the findings were preliminary, warning against sensationalist interpretations. They clung to the narrative of plague victims, suggesting the marks on bones could be misinterpreted, the artifacts misunderstood. But the experts who handled the evidence spoke differently, though carefully. One anthropologist admitted to a journalist, these were not random burials. Something intentional happened here. Something cruel. The revelation sparked new divisions. For the displaced villagers, the forensic details were confirmation. Their ancestors' whispers had been right all along, the church had been a place of suffering, not sanctuary. For historians, the evidence forced uncomfortable questions about the role of clergy and institutions in rural life, questions that many preferred to leave unasked. And for the public, the science only deepened the fascination. News outlets pounced on every new detail, amplifying the horror. Child victims in drowned church, screamed one headline. Evidence of ritual sacrifice, asked another. But with each revelation, the mystery only widened. Why were people chained inside a church? Who ordered it? Was it the priest alone, or a larger network of power? Were these punishments, executions, or ceremonies? One forensic detail hinted at a timeline. Radiocarbon dating placed many of the remains in the late 1700s to early 1800s, astonishingly recent compared to medieval plague years. This suggested that whatever happened in the church had occurred not in distant superstition, but in an era of revolutions, enlightenment, and modernity. In a time when such practices should have long ceased, the valley's church had still clung to them. This realization disturbed even seasoned historians. It meant the atrocities had not been relics of the distant past. They had been contemporaneous with the rise of modern Europe, hidden in plain sight until the flood erased them. The deeper scientists dug, the more political the matter became. Forensic teams received sudden restrictions on what they could publish. Museum curators were instructed to withhold certain artifacts from display. Rumors spread of classified reports locked away in government vaults. Whistleblowers hinted that some findings were too damaging to release. But fragments leaked anyway. Enough to suggest that the truth was darker than plague, darker than punishment, darker even than ritual. One whispered claim circulated among journalists, that DNA testing had revealed familial relationships among the skeletons. That entire families had been chained together, punished, or sacrificed, as a unit. If true, it meant the church's secrets were not random victims, but whole lineages erased in silence. Whether fact or rumor, the claim electrified the public. It gave the story new weight, not just mystery, but tragedy, generational and deliberate. By the end of the forensic phase, the narrative stood transformed. The sunken church was no longer merely a drowned relic, nor even a site of unexplained death. It was a crime scene centuries old, resurfacing only to remind the living of what had been buried, intentionally, perhaps conspiratorially. And though the waters would rise again, drowning the ruins, the science had already preserved the evidence. Bones catalogued. Chains measured. Words deciphered. Yet the most haunting detail remained unanswered, suspended in limbo like the crucifix tilted above the cracked altar. Were these deaths the result of desperation? Punishment? Or worship of something far darker than God? The deeper the investigation went, the clearer one fact became: the truth was not going to arrive in neat answers. For every revelation, a new shadow emerged, stretching the mystery wider. Leaked documents suggested local officials had known about irregularities in the church decades before the valley was flooded. A report from the 1940s mentioned undisclosed chambers and recommended permanent closure of the site. Weeks later, plans for the dam accelerated. Coincidence, or design? No one could say for sure, but the timing felt damning. Even more troubling was the disappearance of evidence. Artifacts catalogued by diverse, masks, parchments, even some bone fragments, were no longer traceable. Officials claimed they had been sent for conservation, but no museum or laboratory admitted to having them. The most incriminating pieces of the puzzle seemed to have vanished into thin air. This fueled the belief that what had been uncovered was never meant to be known. That the flood was not only about electricity, but about erasure. And yet, the evidence that remained refused to be silenced. Families of the displaced villagers launched legal petitions, demanding full disclosure. Historians held conferences, presenting research that pointed to patterns of clerical abuse, religious scapegoating, even ritualized punishment across rural Europe. Forensic scientists leaked enough to confirm what many feared: these were not simple burials. The public split into camps. Some clung to the plague theory, insisting the church's secrets were tragic but explainable. Others saw the site as proof of systemic abuse by religious authority, buried under water to protect reputations. And then there were those who believed something darker, ritual, sacrifice, cult activity, had been sanctified under the guise of Christianity. The church, once a silent ruin, had become a mirror. Each person who looked into it saw their own fears reflected back. For the divers, the climax was personal. One of them, in a rare unguarded interview, described the moment he first saw the chained bones. It wasn't just death. It was suffering. You could feel it in the air, like the walls still remembered. I've been to shipwrecks, battlefields, nothing compared to that. His words echoed online, replayed endlessly, turning the site into a symbol not just of mystery, but of human cruelty. But perhaps the most chilling revelation came not from science, but from memory. An elderly villager, frail but sharp-eyed, recalled a story her grandmother had told. She claimed that, on the night before the valley was evacuated, the church bells rang without ceasing. No one pulled the ropes, yet the sound echoed across the village until dawn. They said it was the chains, she whispered. They said the ones left inside were crying out. Historians dismissed it as folklore, but to those who had seen the photos, the story carried a weight that felt impossible to shake. And then, as if scripted by fate, the rains returned once more. Slowly, the reservoir swallowed the ruins, inch by inch, until the church lay hidden beneath dark waters again. Cameras rolled as the crucifix tilted one last time and disappeared. But unlike before, the silence no longer felt natural. It felt imposed. A closing of the curtain. For the descendants, the reflooding was unbearable. Some wept at the shoreline, watching the place of their ancestors vanish yet again. Others turned away, muttering that perhaps it was better this way, that the valley had always been cursed, and the water was its shroud. For the rest of the world, the drowning of the church was not an ending. It was a beginning. Because now the questions would never stop. What was hidden inside those walls? Why had the state erased it? And what secrets still lingered beneath the waves, waiting for the next drought to draw them back into the light? The story of the sunken village was no longer just history. It had become myth, half-truth, half-nightmare, a puzzle that refused to be solved. And in that refusal, it achieved something powerful: it haunted. Even now, people report standing at the reservoir's edge and hearing echoes. A bell that shouldn't be ringing. Chains dragging faintly through water. Whispers in a language no one speaks anymore. Maybe it is imagination. Maybe it is memory. Or maybe the church is not done speaking, not yet. Because if history teaches us anything, it is this: secrets buried never stay buried forever. And when the droughts return, as they surely will, the church will rise again. And with it, the questions that water cannot wash away. The reservoir lies still today, its dark waters reflecting sky and cloud like polished glass. On the surface, it is serene, even beautiful. But beneath, everyone now knows, silence is layered with secrets. The church sleeps once more, its spire hidden, its cracked walls pressed tight by the weight of water. To some, it feels like justice, that a place of such cruelty should remain sealed, inaccessible. To others, it feels like erasure, that truth has been deliberately drowned for a second time. But whether cursed tomb or historical wound, the church has become more than stone. It is a story now, one that refuses to rest. For the villagers' descendants, the pain has doubled. They did not just lose their homes to the dam. They lost the chance to understand what really happened in their church. Each rumor, each forensic revelation, has only sharpened the question: were their ancestors victims of plague, of punishment, or of something darker still? The answer remains as submerged as the ruins. For historians, the church has become a case study in ambiguity. Its fragments refuse to resolve into a single narrative. Every artifact, every bone, every scrap of parchment points to suffering, but the motive behind that suffering remains blurred. Was it fear of disease? A priest's corruption? A ritual masquerading as faith? Perhaps it was all three, tangled together in ways too complex for records, or even memory, to preserve. And yet, for all the uncertainty, one truth rings out. People were chained. People were left to die inside a house of worship. That reality is chilling enough without embellishment. The public, meanwhile, cannot let go. Documentaries replay the divers' grainy footage. Podcasts dissect the symbols carved into the walls. Online forums trade theories late into the night. The drowned church has become an obsession precisely because it resists closure. It lives in the tension between fact and speculation, feeding imagination like dry tinder. Perhaps that is why so many visitors still come to the reservoir's edge. They stand at the waterline, staring into the opaque surface, waiting for something to rise. On still nights, some swear they see faint outlines just below the water, a spire, a window, a crucifix tilting forward. Others claim to hear bells echoing from nowhere, or chains rattling deep beneath the surface. Rational minds dismiss it as wind, as waves, as imagination. But the whispers persist. Because once you know what lies below, the water is never just water again. The divers, too, cannot forget. Even those who have sworn never to return admit the memories pursue them. One described waking at night with the taste of rust in his mouth, as if he had breathed in the church's stale air all over again. Another confessed that, on reviewing his footage, he caught glimpses of shadows moving where no teammate had stood. He deleted the clips, but the images stayed burned behind his eyelids. Haunting, in the end, is not about ghosts. It is about memory refusing to fade. And the church beneath the reservoir is haunted because it forces the living to remember, the cruelty of institutions, the fragility of truth, the ease with which the past can be drowned. When the droughts return, as climate patterns suggest they inevitably will, the church will rise again. And when it does, so will the questions. New divers will descend into its chambers. New cameras will capture its shadows. And perhaps, next time, the evidence will be impossible to suppress. Until then, the water keeps its secrets. The chains rust quietly in the dark. The bones lie waiting, silent witnesses to whatever happened in that valley. And above, life continues. Lights flicker on, powered by the dam that drowned the village. Families cook dinners, children do homework, people scroll their phones, all sustained by the electricity that came at a price most will never see, never feel. But in the silence between hums of machinery, in the black glass of the reservoir at night, that price waits to be remembered. The drowned village was meant to be forgotten. Instead, it has become unforgettable. And perhaps that is the final curse, or the final justice. That what was buried in darkness has clawed its way back into the light, not as neat history, but as something messier, more powerful. A story without answers. A wound without closure. A reminder that water does not cleanse everything. Because the past does not stay buried. It waits. And one day, when the waters fall again, the church will surface, not just in stone and silt, but in memory, in nightmares, in the restless imagination of everyone who dares to ask, what really happened inside those walls.